You don't hear the gunman coming. That's the point. No shouting. No warning. Just the sudden crack of gunfire tearing through the air, echoing across a quiet Merseyside road, followed by silence so heavy it feels deliberate. In those seconds, a man who had survived prison, rival gangs, and decades of violence was reduced to a body on the pavement, executed without hesitation. This wasn't chaos. It was control. What happened that morning was the final move in a war fought far from public view, a war where names are erased, debts are collected in blood, and survival only delays the inevitable. The killing was meant to send a message, not just to one man, but to everyone who still believed loyalty could protect them. Welcome to Britain's Dark Files, the channel where we uncover the stories Britain rarely confronts, the crimes hidden behind closed doors and the lives destroyed long before police tape ever goes up. If you value in-depth UK crime documentaries that expose the truth beneath the headlines, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share. It helps keep these stories alive, long after the news cycle moves on. This story reveals how the UK underworld truly works, where power is temporary, trust is lethal, and even the most feared figures can be hunted down in daylight. It's the story of a man who wasn't a boss, but something far more dangerous. A fixer. A problem solver. A man trusted to do what others wouldn't. His name was John Kinsella. To the public, he barely existed. No social media trail. No interviews. No glamour. But among criminals, his name carried weight. Kinsella was the man you called when things went wrong, when disputes needed handling, when silence needed enforcing, when problems needed to disappear. For years, he moved close to power, surviving where others didn't. But in organized crime, survival is a mistake that draws attention. Every alliance creates enemies. Every secret adds a target. By the time John Kinsella stepped outside that morning, the decision to kill him had already been signed off. What followed wasn't impulsive violence, it was an execution. And once that trigger was pulled, there was no turning back. John Kinsella didn't rise through the underworld by being loud. He survived by being useful. In a world where attention attracts bullets, Kinsella learned early that the safest place to stand was just out of sight. He wasn't the man giving orders in nightclubs or posing with wealth. He was the man others turned to when situations spiraled out of control and needed to be fixed quietly. His criminal path began long before his name ever carried weight. Kinsella was no stranger to violence, arrests, or prison, and by the time he emerged from those early years, he understood the unspoken rules of survival. Trust was rare. Loyalty was conditional. And silence was priceless. He built a reputation not through fear alone, but through reliability. If Kinsella gave his word, it was kept. If he was brought into a problem, it stayed contained. That reputation placed him dangerously close to power. Over time, he became associated with some of the most feared figures in the Northwest's organized crime network, including men whose names were spoken carefully. Among them was Paul Massey, a dominant presence in Salford's criminal world. Massey was visible. Kinsella was not. But the connection between them was understood by those who mattered. As gang tensions escalated across Greater Manchester and Merseyside, Kinsella's role deepened. He wasn't pulling triggers for attention, he was managing fallout, mediating disputes, and enforcing boundaries when diplomacy failed. In the underworld, that makes you indispensable. It also makes you dangerous to keep around. Because the more problems you solve, the more secrets you collect. And secrets don't stay buried forever. By the time rival factions began tearing into each other, Kinsella had become more than a trusted associate. He was a witness to alliances, grudges, and decisions that would later cost lives. And in organized crime, witnesses don't retire. Long before the gunman closed in on him, John Kinsella had already crossed the most dangerous line of all. He knew too much. Wars in the underworld don't begin with gunshots. They begin with whispers, insults left unanswered, money that changes hands without permission. By the time violence arrives, the decision has already been made. In the mid-2010s, a feud ignited in Salford that would quietly spread beyond its borders, pulling Liverpool and Merseyside into a conflict few outsiders understood. At the center of it was power. Control over territory, influence, and reputation. Two sides emerged, bound by old grudges and newer ambitions, each convinced the other was planning the next move. Associates were forced to choose loyalty or silence, knowing either option carried risk. Neutrality wasn't protection, it was suspicion. Paul Massey stood as a symbol of one side of that divide. Known, feared, and openly powerful, his presence alone shifted the balance. When he was gunned down outside his home in 2015, the message was unmistakable. This was no longer about intimidation. It was about erasure. And once that line was crossed, no one connected was safe. John Kinsella felt the consequences immediately. Massey's death didn't just remove a figurehead, it exposed everyone who had stood close to him. In the aftermath, attention turned to the people who knew where bodies were buried, who had handled disputes, who could link names to actions. Kinsella fit that profile perfectly. As the feud intensified, killings became strategic rather than emotional. Targets were chosen carefully. Timing mattered. Visibility mattered. And so did the message each death would send. Kinsella wasn't marked for something he'd just done, he was marked for everything he represented. Midway through this story, it's worth pausing to acknowledge something unsettling. If you're still watching, it's because these hidden wars shape real lives far beyond the men involved. Stories like this don't end when the headlines fade. Supporting this channel by liking and subscribing helps keep these truths from disappearing into silence. By the time plans were forming, Kinsella's fate was sealed. He had survived the war's opening shots, but in doing so, he became unfinished business. And in the underworld, unfinished business demands a conclusion. The decision to kill John Kinsella wasn't rushed. It had been planned, approved, and rehearsed long before the morning began. By the time he stepped outside with his dogs, the outcome was already sealed. All that remained was execution, not just of a man, but of a message meant to echo through the criminal underworld. Kinsella walked along the quiet street, unaware that every step had been watched. Someone had studied his routine for weeks, noting the times he left his home, the path he took, even the way he held the leash in his hand. On the day of the attack, a lone figure approached on a bicycle, blending seamlessly into the ordinary rhythms of the morning. Then came the shots. Precise. Relentless. Kinsella was struck from behind, collapsing before he could even turn. His partner, caught in the chaos, narrowly escaped the path of the bullets. Within hours, detectives were piecing together the scene. CCTV footage, phone data, and witness statements all painted a chilling picture. This was no spontaneous act. It was coordinated. Someone had tracked Kinsella. Someone had chosen the moment. And someone else had ensured that the hit would go smoothly, from planning to execution. Investigators began to uncover patterns that pointed to a highly organized operation, the kind carried out only by men experienced in violence, precise in execution, and disciplined in secrecy. Names and faces were still hidden, but it was clear that those behind the murder were professionals, individuals who had carried out similar acts before, leaving no trace until it was too late. By the time the arrests came months later, the web of planning revealed two men at the center, one who fired the shots, and another who coordinated from the shadows. The underworld's invisible rules had been followed, and yet, the killers had underestimated the reach of justice. The stage was set for the courtroom to expose the full story. The reckoning didn't come on the streets, but inside a courtroom where secrets that once protected men were stripped of their power. As the trial unfolded, the careful planning behind John Kinsella's murder was laid bare. Jurors heard how the attack had been coordinated, how his movements were tracked, and how every step of the killing fit into a wider campaign of violence that had already claimed other lives. What had once been whispered about in criminal circles was now exposed under the harsh light of justice. The man who pulled the trigger was Mark Fellows, a ruthless enforcer known in the underworld as the Iceman. Alongside him, Steven Boyle had acted as a spotter, silently observing, signaling, and ensuring the operation went exactly as planned. The court made it clear this was no impulsive act of anger, it was a deliberate execution, designed to erase Kinsella and send a chilling message to anyone who might follow in his footsteps. Professional, precise, and merciless. When the verdicts were delivered, there was no relief, only finality. Fellows received a whole life sentence, ensuring he would never see the outside world again. Boyle was handed a lengthy life sentence for his role in the killing. Justice had caught the killers, but the impact of their actions rippled far beyond the courtroom. The road where John Kinsella died returned to normal. Cars passed. Dogs were walked. Life went on. But beneath that everyday surface lies a truth few ever see: power built on fear is temporary, and loyalty bought through violence always comes due. If you've followed this story to the end, you now understand the price of the underworld and the invisible wars that shape our streets. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to ensure Britain's Dark Files continues to uncover the truths hidden behind Britain's darkest crimes.